Okay, welcome back. So today we're going to be talking about Southeast Asia. Let's just jump right into it. So Southeast Asia is this area to the east of the Indian subcontinent. It includes the modern-day countries of Myanmar, which is also known as Burma, Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, and Indonesia. It has basically two parts. The part that we call Indochina, that's the part that's actually connected to the Chinese mainland, and it's this region up here. And then we have the Indonesian archipelago. But of course, there's enormous amounts of overlap between these two areas. There's going to be two major transmissions from India here. Most of the art and art styles are going to be influenced from India, and they're either going to come up around the Bay of Bengal, down into Indochina, or they're going to cross over to Sri Lanka and then over to the archipelago. These were both ancient trade routes. Both Hinduism and Buddhism come over into Indochina and to Southeast Asia pretty darn early. And so we're going to see both Hindu temples and Buddhist temples in this zone, although Buddhist temples come to dominate. One of the things that you may have noticed geographically is this region is not separated from mainland China by any major geographical features. What you'll see here is that all of these rivers, which flow down into Southeast Asia, also start in China. So there were lots of overland and water trade routes along the sea from China. So not surprisingly, you're going to see a lot more Asian influence and Chinese influence in this zone than you would otherwise. Whereas India is really kind of cut off because of these monumental mountains we call the Himalayas, and trade either has to go around the Himalayas into China or around the Himalayas down into Indochina and through that direction. We're going to be talking about a lot of different cultures here, but the two big areas, the two big cultural zones are going to be down in Indochina and Java. Java is this island down here in Indonesia. We're going to see a lot of development there, and then we're also going to see a lot of development on the mainland, mostly the Khmer Empire. So let's talk about Sri Lanka. We haven't talked much about Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is this island, sometimes known as the island of Ceylon. And if you remember our map of Mauryan India, the Mauryan dynasty never got below the tip of India. The tip of India and Sri Lanka always remained independent. And even later, when much of India was conquered, Sri Lanka remained an independent country. And so therefore, we're going to see a completely different development. Sri Lanka becomes Buddhist relatively early. We have a king there who imports Buddhism shortly after the Mauryan dynasty adopts Buddhism, and we're going to see the establishment of stupas. And these stupas look very much like the Mauryan Indian stupas. We're also going to see a later tradition of Buddhism. Unlike other places of India that more or less abandoned Buddhism, once Sri Lanka went Buddhist, it stayed Buddhist, and it's going to remain Theravadan Buddhism, that very strict form of earlier Buddhism, though Mahayana Buddhism and other traditions exist there as well. When we look at early stupas, they're going to have much the same characteristics of stupas that had under the Mauryan and Sungha dynasties in northern India. They're going to be these large semi-spheres of masonry, and they act just exactly the same way. They are meant to be shrines and relics of the Buddha. In fact, this one, which is one of the earliest ones, actually has a relic of the Buddha at the very center of it. This one's been rebuilt. This is what it looked like about 100 years ago, but it's more or less the same as it would have been back then. It has a chhatra and a harmika at the top. It has a balustrade and a precinct, and you would have worshipped it the same way that you did in India by circumambulating around the actual stupa. Stupas continue to be built over the centuries, and while stupas kind of die out as a tradition, because Buddhism dies out as a tradition in India, they build stupas there, and they're still maintained today. This one was built several centuries later, and for a while was the largest masonry structure in the world. It's quite tall. The chhatra has collapsed, and so it no longer holds that title. It is massive, compilation of masonry and fired brick. There are also a series of what we call cave temples, and in these cave temples we see massive reclining statues of the Buddha, which are quite popular in Sri Lanka. In this case, this is Galvihara, and here we have a representation of the parinirvana, or the death of the Buddha. Almost always when you see a reclining Buddha. This is quite late. This is the 12th century. By the 12th century, Buddhism as a major force and as a patron of the arts really isn't going in India anymore, but it's still going strong here in Sri Lanka. When you look at it today, it's part of a ruined monastery. It was cut into this cliffside, but this would have been a completely enclosed building. There would have been a roof over the top of it, and you can see this wall here that you really couldn't have backed up far enough to see the reclining Buddha. There's just a very shallow space in front of it for you to venerate this image. That's important, but we'll talk about that in a bit. When we look at the reclining Buddha, notice that he has very stylized features. He has that clingy drapery. This looks very much like the Gupta style. So this is a Sri Lankan version of Gupta style Buddhas, going all the way back to the 5th and 6th century. Another example is the cave temple complex of Dambulla. This isn't so much as a cave as it is a gigantic stone overhang. And you can see how in the overhang they have built the temple. This part of the temple is actually quite late. It's 18th century. But the temples inside of it, the cave complexes, actually date to the 10th and the 12th century. Here we have colossal stone Buddhas, again carved right out of the living rock, and then covered in stucco or sometimes gold leaf. Here is this reclining Buddha. There's several of these. Here's one just to give you a sense of the scale of this thing. Here you can see the feet have been decorated in a combination of paint and paintings of lilies. But here is the body of this Buddha laid out. And the reason this thing is photographed from the foot is that there's no way to photograph it from the front, because the space in front of it is relatively shallow. This was only accomplished with a wide-angle lens, and there's a little bit more space there. There's only enough space there to allow the adherents to sit down and to venerate the statue. Looking here at the style, you can see that, again, it's very typical of that Buddha style that came out of the Gupta period. We have the roundness of the face, the tightly patterned hair, the clothing that is more or less just lines on the form and doesn't reveal the form or conceal the form in any meaningful or naturalistic way. It's much more this stylized kind of late post-Guptan style of Buddha that we've been used to seeing. So if we go out to the Indonesian archipelago, we get to the island of Java. So here in this map is a corner. Java is one of the major islands in Indonesia. Sumatra is the larger one. There's a whole series of islands that go this way. And in the center, there are two complexes, Borobudur and Candi Prambanan, that are two major temples that were created in the 9th and 10th centuries. The first is Borobudur. Borobudur is the largest stupa still standing. It's absolutely colossal and massive. It is also incredibly complex, and it exists as a kind of one-off. That means that we're not entirely certain what the origin of this thing is or who even created it. There were some very powerful dynasties down there in Java, but they seem to have collapsed very quickly. So within 100 to 200 years of this creation, it was consumed by the jungle and wasn't rediscovered until this part of the world came under British control in the early 19th century. It was eventually transferred to Dutch control, and then in the late 19th, early 20th century, it had a massive restoration. Indonesia, remember, today is predominantly Muslim, and so there isn't a large Buddhist population to support this. It hasn't been for centuries. And again, when a new culture moves in, it's not their religion. It's not something that they hold on to. The entire stupa is more or less the same style of stupas we've seen before, but you could see that it's broken up into three tiers. We have the lower tier, then we have the middle tiers with this kind of pyramid-like structure, and then we have a center circular structure that has a series of smaller subsidiary stupas around the central large stupa. When we look at this plan, ultimately its derivation comes from the great stupas created in India, such as the great stupa at Sanchi. You can see that it has a round part, and then it kind of has a precinct that goes around it. But it's been expanded far beyond that. Where is this coming from? Well, this building is really an amazing piece of conceptual architecture. It's actually based on something called a mandala. What is a mandala? A mandala is a cosmological map. It's not a literal map, but it's a cosmological map designed to help you in your path to enlightenment. Mandalas existed in geometric form. They were part of both Buddhist and Hindu culture. From about the Gupta period on, we see a few on walls and etc. And generally what they are meant to represent is your passage to enlightenment. There is a number of mystical mountains in the Buddhist tradition. The most important is Mount Meru. Mount Meru is this mystical mountain. And this becomes a map of that mystical mountain. But more importantly, it's a map of your progression towards enlightenment. And it's actually broken up according to these ideas of progression. The first and outer layer here, the Kamadhatu. The Kamadhatu is the world of desires. This is the earthly world. This is the world where everybody starts. And you can see that this is a broad platform by which you access the rest of the structure. But then you walk up a series of staircases, and these staircases lead you up to the Ruddhadhatu. The Ruddhadhatu is the world of forms. The world of forms is, of course, this world where you begin to see the world as it really is. And this is the moment as you are making your path to enlightenment. So the world of desires is kind of you beginning your life towards enlightenment. Ruddhadhatu is the beginning of your your tutelage, your practice towards enlightenment. And then you might guess that the upper part, Arupadhatu, Arupadhatu is the formless world, or the world without forms. This is the world where you achieve enlightenment. And so the stupas themselves, which are representing the Buddha, are only found on the higher level. On the lower level, there's not much in the way of decoration, although we'll talk a bit about in a minute. And then you have all of these tiers in between. The tiers in between are decorated with a series of niches. In those niches are Buddhas, and on top of those Buddhas are little tiny stupas. So you can see that the association of the Buddha and the stupa together are very, very strong. But there's a number of reliefs. The reliefs are found here on the paths as you walk these levels. And these reliefs are taken from a variety of sources. The first levels are taken from the Jatakas. The Jatakas are these kind of apocryphal tales of the early life of the Buddha that talk about how you are progressing towards the enlightened nature. And they tell stories of the early life of the Buddha and how he dealt with certain challenges as a way to teach you. Later ones come from later writings and later kind of stories. And so there is a progression. You are supposed to learn from the example of the past Buddhas until you can actually go up to the upper level. Now at some point, somebody expanded the lower base. And you can actually see this. Archaeologically, they excavated one corner here, and you can see that there's an exposed corner. That this lower level here that represented the world of desires, this kind of open stair on the outside, didn't yet exist. And at some point, some later point came in and added it. And you can see that the original had a series of relief sculptures. These relief sculptures are also taken from the Jatakas. So in the original conception of this piece, there was no world of desires or plane of desires. That was just represented by the mundane world that you were existing in, which makes sense. But somebody decided to formalize it later. How much later and who did this, we're not entirely certain. As you progress up this, as you walk up the staircase, here you can see these beautiful reliefs which are carved into the ashlar masonry, these paths all along the way. The reliefs tell a variety of stories, stories from the life of the Buddha, such as the Great Departure, but also They have scenes of figures. When we look at these figures, they're very clearly based on Indian-style art. They're based on these kind of Gupta period images and post-Gupta period images, although they're not as curvilinear. They're not as dynamic in their posing. And there's also a clear shift in the depiction of the ethnicities. That is, that they look less Indian and they look more like natives of the region. That makes sense. And then there's all of these niches, and each one of these niches has a little stupa on top of it, and underneath it is an image of the Buddha. And the Buddha has a variety of hand gestures to indicate what you are supposed to learn. One of the things that's clearly coming from Asian influence is all of these dragons. You'll notice that the niches that they are sitting in have these elaborate scroll work with dragons and faces of dragons and dogs and protective figures. So you're seeing a blend of Indian and Asian styles come together. The ultimate destination of this kind of personal journey of progress, as you progress up this stupa, this mandala, this cosmological map made real in 3 dimensions, you finally come up to the layer of the stupas themselves. And the stupas are very interesting. The center stupa is solid masonry, but the lower stupas, and there's 72 of them, 72 is kind of a perfect number because it's divisible by so many other numbers, in multiples of 3 and 6 and 9 and etc., and 7. These 72 stupas have lotus bases, but they have perforated stonework with various different patterns, and they're really kind of compelling. And if you go up and look into one of them, you will actually see an actual Buddha, and a Buddha sitting in one. This one has been disassembled so that people can look at it. And this is as clear example as anything else that the stupa has become analogous to the presence of the Buddha. It is the image of the Buddha now. And you look at this, you can see, again, the tightly fitting drapery. The drapery is just treated like a web. It's not treated very naturalistically at all. The round face, the tightly patterned and coiled hair. These are all post-Guptan kind of styles. So these are Eastern styles that have come over. By Eastern, I mean Eastern India. These are west of this region. And so you can see the Gupta styles come in. But it's really kind of amazing how the stupa itself is so closely analogized to the Buddha and to the concept of enlightenment. And that's what the stupa exists for, to find your way towards enlightenment. Whoever built this, we have a couple of different contenders. We don't have an actual name. There's no historical records. There's some very powerful dynasties here at the time. But whoever built this, they must have quickly fallen out of power because it's abandoned in short order. And within 50 years, we have a new center of power, and that center of power is going to be located here at Kandy Prambanan, and one of the largest temples of the time. And this represents a new dynasty coming into power, and in this case, this is a Hindu temple. So we went from a Buddhist establishment to a Hindu establishment. Kandy Prambanan is a massive complex with 6 major temples surrounded by a field of several smaller temples. And while we couldn't exactly call these stupas, they function in much the same way, and we see much of the similar architecture. Notice that each of the details, each of the pinnacles here resembles a stupa, the top resembles a stupa, it's just more vertically aligned. This is resembling that multiplicity of architecture that we saw in the Kalinga style in the Eastern India that was developing at this time. And so it's obviously being influenced by those cultures, but it's going its own direction. Here in this map you can see all of these little individual temples reconstructed. The temples are mostly solid masonry, except for a single interior space with a corbelled vault, and inside of that is a statue to Shiva. Notice that the figures here don't have the kind of dynamism that we would expect of figures in Indian art. They seem a little bit more controlled, but it's the same idea. This figure takes on the kind of presence of the god and represents that, almost like that lingam does in Indian architecture. And these were probably worshipped in the same way by circumambulation. Even though all the little pinnacles here look more like stupas than sakharas, it's still very much the same idea. The decoration and the level of decoration on them is just unbelievable. We see guardian lions, sometimes what we call foo dogs, but are actually little lions that are Asian in derivation, segmented figures, lots of sculptural, beautiful details, and including we have representation of figures. And here's where imagery gets very strange, because the imagery is a blend of Buddhist and Hindu imagery. Again, India was predominantly Buddhist and becomes Hindu, so that's not a surprise. When we look at these figures, they have the same kind of dynamic qualities that Pala art has. And if you remember, Pala art is predominantly Buddhist, but borrows images from Hindu art. So the influence here is coming from Pala art, which is up towards the north end of India, near the Bay of Bengal. But we also see, again, guardian figures, motifs that seem much more derived from China. Still, we have some beautifully dynamic narrative reliefs. We have scenes from the Ramayana. The Ramayana is, of course, this great epic myth that comes out of the Hindu tradition. And so we have images and figures and really kind of dynamic figures. The S-curve on the spine is even more dramatic than what we would see on perhaps Indian examples. There is a native tradition of architecture in this region that's also really kind of incomparable and unique, and that's Balinese temples. Balinese temples are located on the island of Bali. Bali is located right here. It's a biggish island, but it's small compared to the rest of Indonesia. And what's interesting is, while all of this territory was taken over by Muslims and is predominantly Muslim today, Bali still remains predominantly Hindu. And so we see temples from the 10th up through the 13th century being created under the influence of these Hindu dynasties that exist and have their center in Java. So when we take a look at the island of Bali, Bali has a number of unique temples. Now we see a completely unique temple style develop here that we will see on a few other islands. We'll see it on the island of Java and elsewhere, but most of these temples are located only on this island. Hence they are unique to the Bali tradition. These temples will take on the form of pagodas. A pagoda is, of course, an Asian structure. We haven't really talked about pagodas, but it's a multi-tiered structure, and it takes on the same role as a stupa, but it has an interior space, and it has roofs. These roofs here are thatched. These often are on the edges of lakes or on mountains. The most important about these is going to be Pura Basaki, I think is how it's said. Pura is the Balinese word for temple, and this one is known as the Mother Temple. This is the temple of all the other puras, or temples, that exist. Many of these temples have a pyramidal platform that leads you to the top, and there is a series of sacred spaces. They are organized according to a progression of sacred space. The most sacred temples are going to be at the back, and the public space here is separated from the more sacred space. But on the temple precinct, we have a number of smaller temples that are all dedicated to individual deities, and again, Hindu deities, generally Vishnu, but also Shiva and other deities. And you can see how these are separated out. There are two styles of gateways that exist in Balinese art. The first and most famous is the split gate. The split gate here really is an astonishing structure, because when you see it, and I'll go back to show you this other example that was on the first slide, these split gates, or Kandi Bentars, are literally like a single tower, almost like a stupa that has been split in half. And it's almost like somebody just cut it in half and separated the distance. And as you walk through this, you are believed to be walking into the sacred space. The second kind of gate is a koryagung, which is a roofed gate, which is essentially very similar to this, but it has a completed tower. So as you get up onto the temple complex, you see more of these kind of thatched roof pagoda structures. But if we go to other temples, such as Lempuyong, Lempuyong has the koryagung style, which has a gate in the center of a roofed structure. But if you look at these split gates, for example, these split gates have just taken the structure and split it one way and the other. It's really a very striking way to think of this space. And I've discovered it's just about the most Instagrammed thing you can find on Bali. Everybody goes there. Everybody takes a tourist photo at Lempuyong of them in front of it, either towards the sea or towards the mountain beyond. You can just find an endless profusion of these. I understand why people are doing it. It's beautiful, but at the same time, come on, get some originality, people. But it really does. It stresses this idea of passing into a separate space, a sacred space. It's completely unique to the Bali tradition. Well, this takes us to the Pagan Empire, sometimes known as the Bagan Empire, B or P. And this is located in what is modern-day Myanmar, or Burma. And the capital city of Pagan, or Bagan, is located right here, right up this river system. And this was one of the major empires there. And this covered the areas that are today modern-day Burma and a little bit of Thailand. But there was a very powerful dynasty that existed there called the Pagan Empire, about 849 to 1297 CE. It too was also Theravadan Buddhist, and they had a very unique tradition as well. When we start looking at their stupas, they have these bell-shaped stupas. So if you remember the stupas towards the end of the Kushan period, as we got into the 5th, 6th, 7th century, they went from kind of semicircular domes to domes on the top of drums with square bases. And so that's very much what's going here. They kind of swell out towards the base here to create this bell-like shape. And so it's really just a modification of that same idea that exists. So these are definitely stupas, and they go through a kind of development. In the 7th century, they're relatively simple. They look very much like the kind of stupas from the early Buddhist periods, but then they become increasingly more ornate. The chatras and shrines at the top get more extended. They end up with more levels, and the lower bottoms get even more elaborate. So that by the time we get to the 10th century, they start to take on this characteristic. Most of these were not covered in gold leaf when they were created. This is something that's been applied to them after that and during the modern period, because this is the tradition today. Here's one that comes from the 12th century. You can see that it has that square outside and the circular inside. It looks very similar to Borobudur, but it's just more massive, taller, less kind of individual sculpture. There are so many of these that are built. Pagan has a large, extensive series of dynasties, and these are built as dynastic structures. Every king wants to have his own stupa built. They become monuments, of course, to Buddhism, but they're also monuments to their dynasty, their lineage. They become kind of funerary monuments. And as they move on, they become taller, more square, more temple-like. And they actually have interior spaces, not very large interior spaces. They're mostly masonry. As you can see, they have subsidiary kind of stupas on the side. There are many hundreds of these in the plain of Pagan. Pagan was a massive sprawling complex, and just outside the city They built hundreds of these. So over the course of centuries, hundreds of these stupas would be built, every kind of person who needed to, and again, it becomes a very photogenic site. We see photos of this in endless variety, and for obvious reasons, it's just really quite beautiful. This is a tradition that continues right up until the 13th century, when again the Pagan Empire collapses, and we don't see nearly so many constructions of these individual kind of dynastic stupas. So that brings us to the Khmer Empire. The Khmer Empire is another one of these very powerful empires. The Khmer Empire starts as a Hindu empire, but because of influence coming from mainland China, it eventually moves over more to a Buddhist empire. It dates from the 9th to the 13th century. It's centered in what is modern-day Cambodia. The main capital at Angkor was its location, but it also controlled most of what is modern-day Thailand as well. And so from the 19th to the 13th century, you have this massive trading empire there. And the two kings that we're going to talk about, Suryavarman and Jayavarman, are the two ones that build the two major complexes that we're going to talk about. But there is such an energy to Khmer art, a real dynamism. The most important Khmer monument is going to be Angkor Wat. Again, this stuff is just the most photogenic stuff you can imagine. Angkor Wat, in this case, is a gigantic temple complex, and it too has a series of towers. And here's where things get interesting. This temple, when it was constructed to Vishnu, again, a Hindu deity. But by the time it was finished, by the time of its end of its life, it was fully a Buddhist temple. Again, you have to remember Buddhism and Hinduism are very universalist faiths. They blend into each other very well. And there are also traditions that argue that Siddhartha Gautama, that is the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni, was in fact an incarnation of Vishnu. So take that for what you will. The center of this temple is a massive complex. In fact, this is the largest temple in the world. There's not one that even comes close. It's kind of astonishing that it was there for a couple of centuries, and then almost immediately after the collapse of the Khmer Empire was abandoned, and again wasn't recovered until modern times. It's not until the 19th century that it's rediscovered and that it's restored. It has become the emblem of modern-day Cambodia. It's on the national flag, etc. But for most of its history, it was abandoned and lost. It has 5 central towers. Each of those towers represents a peak on the mythical Mount Meru. So Meru is this mythical mountain that again is this mountain that is in one of these pure lands. It's this on a cosmological plane, and again represents this approachment to enlightenment. So the entire temple is laid out as a microcosm of the world, and as again a path, not precisely a mandala, but a cosmological map. It is surrounded by a vast moat, and the moat represents the oceans. And so this is a conceptualization of the entire world, with the oceans surrounding the world in the center, and Mount Meru being at its dead center. At the very center is the Bayon Temple, and the Bayon Temple is the part that everybody recognizes as Angkor Wat, but it actually expands far beyond to this entire complex was once part of the temple and was maintained grounds. It's really incredible. The largest temple in the world is built at this time and is active for a couple hundred years and then is more or less abandoned. It's connected by a causeway, so it's isolated. The sacred space is isolated by these waters that represent the waters of the world and the universe, and you would come in through a main gateway. You would walk down this causeway into the main gateway before coming to the Bayon Temple itself. It's really just a breathtaking panorama. The entire structure is made out of stone, and is really insanely complicated. It is an emulation of wooden architecture because you can see that much of the stone here is carved to resemble tile or wooden architecture. So there is a kind of precursor here. Has these huge vaulted interior spaces, monolithic columns, and a vaulted ceiling that probably would have been stuccoed at some time. The interior courtyard is there. Some of the tops of these towers are missing, but 4 out of the 5 are still there. And you can see again, this is meant to look like tile work, even though it's carved in stone. Here are some of the pieces from the upper part of the temple that have been disassembled. They're in the process of restoring it currently. Here is the central tower. Looking up to the massive central tower, you can see it has the same idea of decoration, that each little part represents itself, a kind of tiny little shrine that just gets multiplied as you go on. Really quite compelling. You have gateways and shrines and a whole forest of columns supporting this massive mountain-like structure. And it is supposed to be mountain. It is supposed to kind of represents this concept of Meru. This Mount Meru is this mountain of this cosmological mountain that allows you to pass into enlightenment. Unfortunately, the structure today is actually owned by Vietnam. It's really kind of funny. The current president of Cambodia, who is essentially a dictator, padded his personal fortune by selling this, or at least selling the rights to it, to the government of Vietnam. So the most important monument to the Cambodian people is actually owned by a foreign power. And the dictator of Cambodia doesn't care as long as he gets his money. Vietnam eventually allowed Cambodians to get in for free. So if you are a native Cambodian, you can get in and look at it for free. But foreign tourists are going, and every foreign dollar spent here actually goes, every tourist dollar spent here actually goes to the Vietnam government. It's crazy. Cambodia is not exactly happy about that, but maybe that's all for the best, because the current leadership of Cambodia only cares about himself and filling his own pockets, and Vietnam at least seems to be interested in the tourist trade of this, which is very profitable, so maybe they'll keep maintaining it. Strange world of politics. The entire structure is also covered in beautiful reliefs. We have a wide array of reliefs that line the walls and the courtyards that exist. Most of these reliefs demonstrate the political might and power of Suryavarman, who was really an incredible political power. Here you can see his armies marching with elephants and figures. It's really kind of astonishing that we have this very, very powerful entity for 2 or 3 centuries that just poof disappears more or less afterwards. One of the most celebrated reliefs here is the relief of Vishnu churning the sea of milk. So this is a story where in order to bring something up from the bottom of the ocean, they take a great serpent, they wrap it around a mountain, and then everyone tugs on one side of the serpent and on the other side of the serpent to spin this mountain, to churn the sea of milk, to turn it into butter. It's a very famous story, and one of the great mytho-historical legends regarding Vishnu, and it takes over this massive wall. And so we have a series of devatas, attendants, and figures with Vishnu in the center, kind of orchestrating all of this activity, while everyone else pulls on either side of this poor serpent. When we talk about the art styles here, the art style is very curvilinear, perhaps even a bit more curvilinear than we see in styles in India. The faces, of course, are going to reflect the native Khmer people, as do the hairstyles and the headdresses. But there's not quite as much dynamism as we would expect from Indian art. A lot of it, even though we do have quite some dynamic poses, they don't seem as natural or as moving. They seem more kind of poised. So Angkor Wat is located right here, but a larger complex called Angkor Thom is actually built to the north, which again is this massive microcosm of the world. This thing has a series of colossal gates. So you walk into the gates. This one was, again, built as a Buddhist temple. Didn't start out as a Hindu temple. This one was built as a Buddhist temple. But we have these colossal gates with four faces. Faces are carved directly onto the towers. And we can see the skill and the craftsmanship present on these. It's really just remarkable stuff. But for all the same reasons that empires collapse everywhere else, the Khmer Empire collapsed and ultimately fell apart. As for a few centuries there, the biggest, most lavish temples in the world were there in Cambodia, and then were quickly abandoned and consumed by the jungle until Westerners during the colonial period took an interest in them and kind of reclaimed them, and now there are a point of pride amongst the Cambodian people. Well, that's all I've got for Southeast Asia. We're going to stop there. I know that's a little bit short, but hey, that's okay, because we have lots more to go on. We're going to push forward with China, so hopefully I'll get this one up today. This is Wednesday. The one for China is going to be quite long and involved. There's an awful lot of throat clearing we have to get through on China, and so that's probably not going to be uploaded until Thursday. Thanks so much, and we'll see you for the next one.